The garage door was open when I pulled into the driveway, and the concrete floor where my motorbike had sat for 11 years was bare except for an oil stain shaped like a comma. I remember standing there with my key still in my hand, staring at that empty rectangle of floor like it might explain itself if I looked long enough. Inside the house, I could hear laughter. Not quiet laughter. The kind that spills out from a kitchen when people have poured a second round of drinks and stopped caring who hears them. I recognized my mother-in-law's voice first, then her brother Carl's booming half-shout of a laugh that always sounded like he was trying to win an argument nobody was having. I walked in through the side door, the one that goes straight into the kitchen, and there they all were. My wife, Renee, was standing at the head of the table with a glass of white wine in her hand, and when she saw me, she didn't look nervous. She looked proud. That's the part that still gets me, even now. She looked proud. There he is, she said, like I was the guest of honor at a party I hadn't been told about. Perfect timing. Carl raised his glass to me. Her mother, Dolores, was already reaching for a serving dish like this was just another Sunday. Her sister Kim was filming something on her phone, and I remember thinking, in the stupid disconnected way your brain works when it hasn't caught up to what's happening yet, that I hoped I wasn't in whatever she was filming. I have news, Renee said, and she said it the way you'd announce a pregnancy or a promotion. I sold your old motorbike. $55,000, Danny. $55,000. The room erupted. Not polite applause. Real cheering, the kind you'd expect if someone had won the lottery. Carl slapped the table. Dolores said something about finally being able to help with Kim's kitchen renovation, and I stood there in the doorway of my own house, still holding my keys, waiting for someone to tell me this was a joke. It wasn't a joke. That motorbike wasn't just a bike. It was a 1974 Norton Commando that my father had bought used in 1981, the year before I was born, and had spent the next 30 years slowly bringing back from the dead in our garage in Ohio. I grew up watching him lie under that thing on a creeper board, cursing at carburetors, teaching me the names of parts before I could tie my shoes. When he died, I was 31 years old, and the bike was the only thing of his I asked for. Not the house, not the tools, not the coin collection my brother fought over for 2 years. Just the bike. I'd spent the better part of a decade since then keeping it exactly the way my father left it, riding it twice a year on the anniversary of his birthday and the anniversary of his death. Always alone. Always down the same stretch of county road he used to take me on when I was 12. Renee knew all of this. I'd told her the story more times than I could count, usually on nights when I'd had a little too much bourbon and needed to talk about him. She'd nodded along every time, held my hand, told me she understood. Apparently understanding has a price tag, and it's $55,000. You sold it, I said, and my voice came out flatter than I expected, like all the air had gone out of it before the words could form properly. I got an incredible price, Renee said, still smiling, still not reading the room correctly, or maybe reading it exactly right and just not caring. Danny, a collector from Columbus, paid full asking and then some. Carl helped me find the buyer. We didn't even have to negotiate. Carl helped me find the buyer. I looked at him then. This man who had never once in 15 years of marriage treated me like more than a mild inconvenience who happened to be attached to his sister, and I understood that this hadn't been an impulse. This had been planned, arranged, coordinated, probably over weeks, maybe months, in text threads and phone calls I was never part of, about a piece of my father that I was never asked about. "Where's the check?" I asked. "Already deposited," Dolores said cheerfully, like this detail was somehow a point in their favor. Renee put it straight into the joint account so we could start looking at contractors for Kim's kitchen this week. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still, the way a lake goes still right before it freezes over, when the surface stops moving but you know something underneath is changing shape. "That bike wasn't yours to sell," I said quietly. The laughter finally stopped. Renee's smile faltered, just slightly, the first real crack I'd seen since walking in. "It's a bike, Danny. It's not like I sold your father. It was sitting in a garage collecting dust. This money is going to actually do something. It's going to help family." I wanted to ask her which family she meant, because the family that raised that motorbike from a rusted frame into something that ran like poetry down a back road wasn't sitting at this table drinking wine and planning a kitchen renovation. That family was in a cemetery 40 minutes from here, under a granite stone with dates I still can't say out loud without my throat tightening. I didn't say any of that. Not yet. I just turned around, walked back out through the side door, and sat down on the front step of my own house while the celebration resumed behind me, muffled through glass and wood, like laughter heard underwater. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the streetlights to come on, running through 15 years of marriage in my head, looking for the moment I'd missed. The moment where Renee stopped seeing my grief as something to protect and started seeing it as an asset she was entitled to liquidate whenever her family needed cash. I didn't find that moment that night, but I found something else instead, sitting there in the dark with my keys still digging into my palm. I found out exactly how much my quiet was worth to them, and I decided, right there on that step, that I was done paying that price for free. The night went on without me. I heard the celebration die down eventually, heard car doors slam in the driveway around 10, heard Renee's footsteps come up the stairs a little after that, unsteady from wine, humming something under her breath like she just closed a business deal instead of selling off the last tangible piece of my father I had left in this world. I didn't go inside until almost midnight. When I finally did, the kitchen was clean, dishes put away, wine glasses rinsed and drying in the rack, as if nothing unusual had happened there at all. That's the thing about Renee's family that took me years to fully understand. They don't just do the hurtful thing. They tidy up after it so fast that by morning you start to wonder if you overreacted. I found Renee in bed, scrolling on her phone, and when I sat down on the edge of the mattress, she didn't even look up right away. "You're still upset," she said. "Not a question." "You sold my father's motorcycle to help pay for your sister's kitchen," I said. "I think upset is generous." She sighed, the exact sigh she uses when she thinks I'm being difficult about something that should be simple. "Danny, it's been 11 years. You ride it twice a year. I thought I was doing something good. $55,000 is life-changing money. It wasn't yours to change your life with. We're married. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. That's how this works." I wanted to tell her that if that were true, then half of Kim's new kitchen was mine too, and I'd like it removed immediately, cabinet by cabinet, until the number balanced back out. I didn't say that. I was still too far underwater to be clever yet. I just asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the driveway. "Who bought it?" "A collector. Some friend of Carl's from a bike club in Columbus. I want his name." Something flickered across her face then, quick, almost nothing. But I'd been married to this woman for 15 years and I knew her flickers the way you know weather coming in off a lake. "Why does it matter?" "It's done, Danny. The money's already moved. Because I want to know who's got my father's bike sitting in their garage right now." She gave me a name eventually. Ray Das. Said he ran a small restoration shop outside Columbus. Said Carl had known him for years through some motorcycle forum. Said the whole transaction had happened over a single weekend while I was on a work trip to Pittsburgh. Last plan. No time for me to weigh in, object, or even say goodbye to the one object in this house that still smelled faintly, if you got close enough to the seat, like the leather conditioner my father used to use. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there next to her, staring at the ceiling fan turning in slow circles, and I let myself go back to 1998, to the summer I was 11 and my father first pulled the tarp off that Norton in our garage. It had been sitting in a barn for a decade before he found it, engine seized, frame rusted through in 2 places, one wheel missing entirely. Everyone told him it was scrap. My mother called it a money pit before he'd even gotten it home. But my father just ran his hand over the tank, over the faded paint and the dents, and said the same thing he said about most broken things in his life. Give it time and the right hands, and everything worth saving shows you it was worth saving. I spent every summer after that handing him wrenches, holding flashlights, learning what a carburetor float does and why timing matters and how you can tell a good weld from a bad one just by running your thumb along the seam. By the time I was 17, that bike ran. By the time I was 25, it ran beautifully. By the time my father died at 63, sitting in his recliner on a Tuesday afternoon with the local news on and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, that bike was the closest thing to a diary he'd ever kept. Every scar and modification a sentence in a language only the two of us fully spoke. I got up before sunrise the next morning and did something I probably should have done the moment I heard her name it and done deal. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and searched for Ray Das Restoration, Columbus, Ohio. Nothing came up. Not a website, not a business listing, not a single mention on any of the vintage motorcycle forums I checked. And I checked 4 of them, the same forums where a genuine Norton restoration shop would have left some kind of footprint over the years. I searched variations of the name, I searched Carl's name alongside motorcycle clubs in the Columbus area. I found a Carl Prude who'd once commented on a thread about carburetor rebuilds. 6 years old, one post, nothing since. That's when a cold feeling from the driveway came back, except this time it wasn't grief. It was something closer to suspicion, sharp and clarifying, cutting through the fog of the last 12 hours like a knife through wet paper. I called the bank before it opened, sat in my car in the parking lot until the doors unlocked at 9, and asked to see the deposit history on the joint account. The teller, a young woman named Priya who'd helped us open that account 4 years earlier, pulled it up without much hesitation since my name was still on the paperwork too. $55,000 had indeed been deposited 3 days earlier, exactly like Renee said, but it hadn't come from an individual named Ray Das. It had come from an LLC, Prude Family Holdings. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after Priya printed the statement for me, staring at those 2 words, feeling something shift permanently in the way I understood my marriage, my in-laws, and the 11 years I'd spent believing that grief, at least, was mine alone to carry and mine alone to decide what to do with. Because Prude was Renee's maiden name, and Carl Prude didn't run a bike club. He ran a property investment company 2 towns over, one he'd started with money he borrowed from his mother and never quite managed to pay back. My father's motorcycle hadn't been sold to any collector in Columbus. It had been sold, somehow, to Carl's own company, which meant one of 2 things, and both of them made my hands go cold against the steering wheel. Either Carl had personally paid $55,000 of his business's money for a 40-year-old motorcycle he had no real interest in restoring, which made no financial sense for a man notoriously careful with every dollar he touched, or the bike had never actually been sold to anyone outside the family at all. It was still out there somewhere, sitting in a garage that wasn't mine, under a roof that belonged to people who had celebrated its disappearance from my life like a windfall, while I sat in my own driveway grieving something they never intended to actually let go of. I started the car, and for the first time since walking through that kitchen door, I felt something other than sorrow settle into my chest. I felt purpose. I didn't go home right away. I drove instead, no real destination, just county roads with the windows down, the kind of drive my father used to take when he needed to think without anyone watching him do it. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, I ended up parked outside Carl's office, a squat brick building off Route 9 with Prude Family Holdings stenciled in gold on the glass door, and I sat there for 20 minutes just watching people come and go before I finally understood what I actually wanted. Not a scene. Not yet. I wanted proof. I called my cousin Marcus that afternoon, the one person in my life who'd spent 15 years doing title searches and property records for a real estate law firm downtown, and who owed me a favor going back to a car repair I'd done for him without charging labor. I gave him the LLC name and asked him, as casually as I could manage, to see what he could find on Prude Family Holdings, specifically anything involving recent asset purchases, vehicle titles, storage units, anything. He called me back 2 days later, and what he found rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. The motorcycle had never been titled to a Ray Das. There was no Ray Das anywhere in the Ohio BMV system connected to a 1974 Norton Commando. Instead, the title had been transferred directly from my name, forged with a signature Marcus said looked close enough to pass a quick visual check but wouldn't survive a real forensic comparison, into Prude Family Holdings LLC, 3 weeks before Renee ever said a word to me about selling anything. 3 weeks. She'd known for 3 weeks. The dinner, the cheering, the $55,000 announced like a lottery win, all of it had been theater performed for an audience of 1, staged well after the actual transaction had already happened quietly behind my back. Marcus found something else too, something that took the ground out from under me in a different way. Prude Family Holdings had taken out a business loan 4 months earlier, 6 figures, to cover renovation costs on 3 rental properties Carl had overextended himself buying the previous year. The loan was already in trouble. Carl had missed 2 payments. The bank, according to public filing records Marcus had access to, was 1 missed payment away from calling the whole thing due. $55,000 was exactly enough to bring that loan current and buy Carl another 6 months of breathing room. They hadn't sold my father's motorcycle to a collector. They'd used it as collateral, dressed up as a family windfall, to bail out a business that had nothing to do with me, using a signature that wasn't mine, on a title that was never theirs to transfer. I sat with that information for 4 days before I said anything to Renee. 4 days of coming home, eating dinner across from her, watching her talk about Kim's kitchen contractors like everything in our life was ordinary, and saying nothing because I needed to understand exactly what I was going to do before I let her know I knew. I went back to that garage first. Not Carl's office, the actual storage unit Marcus's records pointed to, a facility off Route 40 I'd driven past 100 times without a second thought. I didn't have a key, and I wasn't foolish enough to try breaking in. I just drove there on a Thursday evening and sat outside, watching, until I saw a familiar shape of a tarp-covered vehicle through the gap under a rolled-up door 2 units down, being loaded onto a trailer by 2 men I didn't recognize. I got close enough before they noticed me to see one corner of that tarp lift in the wind, enough to see a sliver of tank paint faded red with a pinstripe my father had touched up himself in 2003, enough to know with absolute certainty that I was looking at what was left of the only inheritance I'd ever asked for. They were moving it, which meant Carl, or someone, suspected I might be getting close to the truth, and they were relocating the evidence before I could act on it. That was the night I stopped grieving and started building a case. I didn't confront Renee that week. I confronted her mother instead, on a Sunday afternoon when Dolores was alone at her kitchen table doing a crossword puzzle, because I'd learned a long time ago that Dolores was the weakest link in that family's carefully maintained silence. She liked feeling important. She liked being the one who knew things. I told her I'd seen the bank records. I told her I knew about Pruitt family holdings, the missed loan payments, the forged signature. I watched the crossword pen freeze in her hand, watched her face do the math on how much I actually knew versus how much she'd need to lie about to protect her son. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, she finally said, quieter than I'd ever heard her speak. Carl was desperate, Danny. He was going to lose everything. Renee said the bike was just sitting there, that you barely rode it, that you'd understand eventually. She forged my signature. Dolores didn't deny it. She just looked down at her half-finished crossword like the answer to 17 across might also explain how her family had convinced themselves that stealing from me was an act of love. Where is it now? I asked. I don't know exactly. Carl said something about moving it somewhere safer until things calmed down. Danny, please, if this goes to the police, it'll destroy him. He has kids. I stood up from that table without answering her, because for the first time in this entire ordeal, I understood something with total clarity. This was the conversation I was going to win by asking nicely, and it was the wound Renee was ever going to heal by apologizing, because she'd never once, in 4 days of watching me grieve at her own dinner table, shown a single sign that she thought she owed me an apology at all. She thought she'd solved the problem. She thought grief had an expiration date, and mine had passed, and whatever remained of my father in that garage was fair game the moment it stopped being useful to my healing and started being useful to her family's survival. I drove home that night with Marcus's documents in a folder on the passenger seat, a forged title, a bank statement, a loan filing on the edge of default, and a decision forming in my chest that felt less like anger now and more like architecture. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to threaten. I was going to do what my father taught me to do with anything broken and worth saving. I was going to take it apart piece by piece, in front of everyone, until there was nowhere left for any of them to hide. I gave it 2 more weeks before I moved. 2 weeks of quiet dinners, of Renee talking about contractor quotes like nothing in our house had cracked open, of me smiling and nodding and gathering exactly what I needed while she mistook my silence for surrender. My father used to say that the quietest moment in any repair job comes right before you find out whether the thing is fixable or whether it needs to be let go entirely. I was in that moment now, and I already knew which way this was going to break. Marcus helped me build the full picture, not just the forged title and the loan filing, but bank transfer records showing the $55,000 moving from the joint account into Pruitt family holdings within 18 hours of that celebration dinner, dressed up on paper as a family loan repayment that had never existed until Carl's bookkeeper backdated it 3 days after I started asking questions. Marcus also tracked down the actual storage facility 2 towns over, using the trailer plate I'd photographed the night I watched them move it. The Norton was there, under a different tarp, listed on the unit's rental agreement under Carl's name alone. I didn't go to the police first, though I had enough for a forgery complaint and knew it. I went to the bank instead, because Priya had told me something useful during our first conversation, almost in passing. Since my name was still on that joint account and the title transfer had used my forged signature, the bank had its own exposure here, its own liability for processing and deposit tied to a fraudulent transaction. I filed a formal dispute. I provided Marcus's documentation. Within 9 days, the bank froze the incoming funds trail and opened an internal fraud investigation that named Prute Family Holdings directly. That got Carl's attention faster than any confrontation ever could have. A defaulted loan is a private embarrassment. A federal bank fraud inquiry is a business death sentence. The family dinner where it all came apart wasn't one I orchestrated. It was one Dolores called. Panicked 3 days after the bank investigation started, insisting everyone needed to talk this through as a family before, in her words, things got out of hand. I sat at that same table where they'd celebrated 11 days earlier, across from Carl, who wouldn't meet my eyes, and Renee, who still hadn't fully understood that this wasn't about a motorcycle anymore. I laid the folder on the table, the forged title, the bank statement, the backdated loan document. I didn't raise my voice once, because my father never raised his either, not when something mattered enough to say quietly, "You forged my signature," I said to Renee, "to steal the last thing I had of my father so your brother could bail out a business he mismanaged, and then you threw a party about it in my own kitchen." She cried. She said she never thought it would go this far, that Carl told her it was just paperwork, that she'd panicked when she realized what she'd actually signed her name to alongside mine. Carl said nothing at all, just stared at the folder like it might disappear if he waited long enough. Dolores kept saying the word family over and over, as though repeating it enough times might still mean something in that room. I told them the bank fraud investigation was already moving and I wasn't going to interfere with it. I told Carl I wanted the Norton back, fully, immediately, or I'd add a personal forgery complaint to what the bank had already started and let a detective sort out who knew what and when. I watched him do the math on prison time versus pride and pride loss. I got the bike back 4 days later from that storage unit off Route 40, still under its mismatched tarp. One mirror slightly bent from being moved carelessly, but otherwise whole. I didn't ride it that day. I just sat with it in my garage for a long time, hand on the tank the way my father used to rest his, and let myself feel something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, just relief, heavy and quiet, like setting down something I'd been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. Renee and I separated 2 months later, not because of one dinner or one bike, but because that night forced me to see clearly what our marriage had actually been running on for years, an assumption that my grief was negotiable and her family's needs were not. Carl's business didn't survive the fraud inquiry. The bank pursued its own claim separately from mine, and by spring his company had folded under the weight of a default he could no longer outrun with borrowed motorcycles and borrowed time. I don't tell this story for sympathy, and I don't tell it because it ended with everyone getting exactly what they deserved, because it didn't, not cleanly, not the way stories are supposed to end. Renee lost a marriage she probably could have kept if she'd simply told me the truth 11 days earlier instead of a party. Carl lost a business he might have saved with an honest conversation instead of a forged signature, and I got my father's motorcycle back. But I also learned, at 51 years old, that some silences in a marriage aren't peace. They're just grief, sitting quietly, waiting to find out what it's actually worth to the people around you. I still ride that Norton twice a year, same as always, down that same stretch of county road, but now I ride it alone in a different way than I used to. Not because my father is gone, but because I finally understand that the things worth protecting in this life are rarely protected by staying quiet about them. My father spent 30 years bringing that bike back from something everyone else called scrap. If you've ever had someone decide, on your behalf, what your grief was worth, I hope you find whatever your version of that garage is. And I hope you have the nerve to open the door,